Before we get started, I have a quick favor. I've been self-funding the Finding Genius podcast for 5 years now. I've done over 3,000 episodes. And as you can see on YouTube, we're up over 1 million views on the channel, which is fantastic. The next thing I really want to push on is to get up to 10,000 subscribers. Because once we do, we'll be able to put a donate button and we'll be able to solicit donations to help keep the podcast running and to also get the Finding Genius Foundation moving along. We have a big project studying anxiety, depression, and PTSD and working on a product to help people overcome these problems because I've seen them explode recently after the last 2 years of the whole virus situation. So if you would, please subscribe to the podcast. That would help us tremendously. Give us a thumbs up and check in the description for Buy Me a Coffee. It's about $5. If you could buy me a coffee, I'd really appreciate it. It would help keep the channel going, and I love coffee. Thank you.
Forget frequently asked questions.
Common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
Go above and beyond.
they become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%.
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
With Richard Jacobs.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius Podcast. My guest today is Chuck Cannon. He's a senior scientist. We're going to talk about ecological evolution. He's part of the Morton Arboretum. We're going to be looking at trees, the biology and behavior of individual trees, and again, what may be called ecological evolution. So, Chuck, welcome.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. Thanks for having me on your podcast.
Yeah, if you would, tell me a bit about your background and how you ended up working at the Arboretum, and then we'll go over your current work after that.
Sure. Yeah, it's a long and winding story to become a botanist here at the Morton Arboretum for myself. I like to tell this story because I think a lot of people think you have to kind of be born a botanist, but there's a chance for people to come to that later in life, because I certainly was not really that interested in plants when I was an undergraduate. For example, I was very interested in primate behavior and evolution, and so I was an anthropology major actually, but I had the great opportunity to go to Indonesia and do a research project, and I was a research assistant for about a year at a research site there in Kalimantan in Indonesian Borneo. And so I went to study primates, but it was actually very difficult to study them. They're very agile and they move in the canopy very quickly. And so I would get up very early in the morning and go out and spend all day trying to follow the monkeys to get behavioral data. And I'd come back with, just a few minutes of data. But part of my responsibilities also were to monitor the trees and note which ones were flowering and try to identify them and that kind of stuff. And I just found I had a knack for it. And I found that there was a lot to be learned. And we really didn't know much about the trees. And in some ways, kind of not so flattering. I didn't have to get up at 4 a.m. I could get up at 8 or 9 and the trees would still be there, and so I could go out and study them at any time in the day. And that just kind of became my thing. And it just kind of snowballed. And I also kind of had an insight that, if you want to maintain primates, if you want to conserve primates, you got to have a forest. And that kind of became the place I started to focus on, how trees create a forest and how trees interact with animals and with one another and that kind of stuff.
So you mean how trees create a forest? Let's get into that. What does that mean?
Yeah, it's a pretty complex topic. I mean, because, we talk about forests. So, for example, one question I've always had in my mind is an urban forest. We talk about urban forests. When do individual trees become a forest and you begin to see those functions and kind of interactions and things? So, from the natural kind of undisturbed forest, it is really dominated by trees. And so you have an environment that is completely created, many different kinds of microclimates and habitats and things on the surface of the branches and on the surface of the leaves. And so it's a very complex environment that these trees create that then allow a lot of other animals and insects and many other organisms to live there. So
I guess by the root bundle, there's the rhizosphere there's all kinds of bacteria and fungi and everything. And I don't know if this is an apt analogy, but a tree seems to be like someone that has stuck their head in the ground. Like the brain of the tree. Maybe I'm wrong, appears to be the root bundle, and the head below ground takes in oxygen, but then the legs and the body taking carbon dioxide. So it seems like the tree lives in two worlds, literally above and below ground. Very different.
Yeah. I mean, that was the point I was planning on making, is that trees are actually an amazing kind of integrator of the conditions in a site. So they do kind of integrate above and below ground conditions. And so they're kind of at that interface, right? And so they're one of the few organisms that do that. And so they're actually a really good indicator of environmental quality. And, if you wanted to design a sensor for an environment, a tree is a very good one. We already have a very, naturally engineered, evolved organism that can tell us a lot about the environment, because it does integrate that kind of below and above ground conditions. And
what are some of the things that you can learn from a tree, because it is above and below ground, for instance, that maybe you can learn from another plant or a sensor?
Well, I mean, for example, we can look at many different aspects of the tree's physiology. I mean, so a tree does have, in a sense, some vital signs, so each day sap begins to flow up the tree. So as soon as sunlight hits the leaves, you can have all that photosynthetic reaction beginning to occur, and you have, oxygen and carbon dioxide, water and carbon dioxide being combined, creating oxygen and sugars, and that's beginning to draw water up. So there's kind of a heartbeat a tree has once a day, so it just kind of kicks off, that sap begins to flow, and it responds a great deal to the environment. And depending on, soil moisture, the vapor pressure in the air, and then all the other parts of the plant, how well its vascular tissue, so it has, the way a tree grows, it's adding tissue on the outside of the stem every year. So most of the tree is actually dead. And
I've heard that. Yeah. The trunk, there's just a ring of living tissue on the outside of the whole trunk, right?
That's
the bark.
exactly right. Yeah. So it adds that tissue on every year. And so it creates this ring. So that's how we can read the age of a tree, but we can also read a lot of other information out of the sequence of rings, how it grew in response to the environment. And so that there's a historical element to the tree being a sensor. So we've been able to reconstruct previous climates and things from being able to look at sequence of trees further and further back in history and align those rings where they've grown, in productive years versus drought years. And so
what's the as a percentage of the circumference of a tree, or the thickness, the radial thickness, what percent is the living layer?
Yeah, it's pretty small, honestly. Because you've got a single layer of cambium, which is kind of like the stem cell in a plant. It can differentiate into any tissue, and so the cambium is right there in between the xylem, which is on the inside, and the phloem, which is on the outside. And the xylem dies and becomes wood and actually functions while the cells are dead. So the conducting the liquid and nutrients and things up from the ground into the leaves, that is a passive process through negative pressure. And so there's nothing really pumping water out of the ground or anything. It's just the physical structure of those wood cells that allow the water to be drawn up from the roots to the leaves. And so those tissues die as they develop. And that's just right on the inside, right underneath the bark. And then you have the phloem, which is the living tissue that is kind of bringing things and distributing things across the whole plant from the leaves down to the roots. So there's hormones and sugars and other things being transmitted through the phloem. So really,
if you have a tree that, let's say you have a really tall tree, I don't know, 100-foot tall redwood or something.
Yeah.
How would you ever get nutrients up to the leaves? Like, does the tree does it take the liquids up a certain height and then they sit for a while and collect in a basin and then they go up further? Like, or is it a continuous drawing all the way up the length of the tree that high?
It's kind of a mystery still. Some of that is, it kind of defies physics in a certain sense, because you do have these very high negative pressures that are required to draw the water up that far. And you do have some kind of reservoir. You just have a column of water. And that's why really tall trees, they are at the physiological limits of the height at which you can draw that water. So they can be quite vulnerable to drought and things. So like the fog and things. And so actually trees can take in water through their leaves to some extent. And there's been some evidence of that. And it's a little bit controversial and not clear in all cases, but in situation where you have very high humidity and fog and things, that's condensing on the leaves and on that tissue. The plant can actually draw in moisture above ground and at height. So the really tall trees, yeah, it's quite amazing how they do, but it really requires it has to be a completely unbroken column of water, and it involves kind of how water molecules behave in really tiny capillaries, and so they're connected together,
leaf,
cohesive to the sides of the wall, and things like that.
Oh, okay. So yeah, maybe capillary action is able to overcome the pressure drop that's needed to get water up that high.
And you can have embolism, so you have air pockets. So that's the threat to a tree. If we get air bubbles in our vascular system, we can very quickly die. A tree, it will accumulate air bubbles as it gets more and more drought stressed, because just that tension is too much, and any kind of imperfection in the surface or any kind of impurity, they can actually pop a bubble out, and that will then block that part of the vascular system. And so as that accumulates, as a drought continues, the tree can eventually not be able to draw sufficient water up.
Before we continue, I've been personally funding the Finding Genius podcast for 4.5 years now, which has led to 2,700 plus interviews of clinicians, researchers, scientists, CEOs, and other amazing people who are working to advance science and improve our lives and our world. Even though this podcast gets 100,000 plus downloads a month, we need your help to reach hundreds of thousands more worldwide. Please visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click on Support Us. We have 3 levels of membership from $10 to $49 a month, including perks such as the ability to see ahead in our interview calendar and ask questions of upcoming guests, transcripts of podcasts you're interested in, the ability to request specific topics or guests, and more. Visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click Support Us today. Now back to the show.
But then the water...
Well, as a drought happens, the tissues would dry out and shrink, I would think, unavoidably, and that would cause mechanical stress on the rest of the system.
And the tree does react too. I mean, it can do things like just shut down its stomates and just basically hold its breath and not photosynthesize as much, and so it doesn't transpire. And in trees, there are different strategies that trees can take depending on their physiology and things to prevent. So they a lot of times they do just shut down. They'll even go to the extreme of dropping their leaves early. You might have seen it in a drought condition. The tree just turns brown and drops its leaves. It's just kind of shutting down and preventing itself from doing damage to its vascular system. Yeah.
Very interesting. I was thinking about you said fog or water getting on the leaves. So they have a waxy coating, so the water would sit there in like a bead, and then I guess the leaf could sense the water there. Maybe the weight distribution on the leaf changes, and maybe it could open up its stomata or other structures and suck up the water that's sitting there on the leaf. Maybe the design of leaves themselves and the waxy coating not only serves a purpose to keep water out, but also to allow water to pool there and be drawn in.
Yeah, it's kind of getting to the limits of this is not my area of expertise, and so I don't really want to try to say too much, but I think it does just kind of being saturated, and it actually can draw it in through the stomates. If there is a osmotic pressure between those two surfaces, inside and outside, and there's a pore, it can begin to draw water in through that pore, and that's about as far as my understanding goes. I apologize.
No, it's all right. Has anyone, I thought about this with plants, like what if you had a software that it looked at the trunk and all the branches and all that, it took the thickness and the length and all that stuff, and it calculated for every input into the trunk, every nutrient input, how would that nutrient be distributed? Let's say you had a tree with just 2 branches, right, and I put like 1 gram of nutrient, I'm just making this up, near the root bundle. So it will be drawn up and it gets equally distributed by the time it got to the 2 branches if they were same size and dimension. But has anyone made software to do that, to model, let's say you have a fruit tree and you want to see what would be the ideal pruning or what would be the ideal amount of branches, thickness of branches, etc., to maximize fruit production? Has anyone done such a thing?
There are general models about that type of thing, and it's something I was kind of playing with. I'm a big believer in adopting technology, and I've worked a lot with engineers and robotics people, and because trees are very difficult organisms to study, like you said, the most important organ, the roots are underground, and how do you study something that's underground and you've got most of it above your head where you can't really reach it very well? So, we've done things, the technology has advanced pretty quickly. You can, use photogrammetry or LiDAR these days to create a 3D model of a tree, but they're very complex structures. And that's one thing I've learned. I've yet to find a mathematician who can really kind of put all that together. But it's reaching to the point where we could really begin to kind of model physically each tree, and you could begin to think about how those nutrients are distributed and, even how they shade themselves, because the leaves at the top of a tree are receiving a very different light and humidity environment than the trees that the leaves at the bottom of the tree. And so there's a lot of things going on there. And that's one thing that I wanted to pursue, is kind of a whole tree biology of kind of trying to integrate all of the different parts of the tree together to understand how they kind of collaborate and share resources. And we're not there yet, but I think we're definitely kind of moving in that direction. And I think technology is allowing us to apply these things in more and more detail. And so we do have good 3D models of trees, and we kind of track them through time a little bit. But that's another thing too. I mean, trees live on really different time scales. And so that's one of the big challenges about studying trees, because, to even study the single lifespan of a tree, I'd have to get my grandkids to continue my work. So we get a tiny little snapshot, and that may not always be a great indication of what the tree is doing over 75 years or 100 years.
Yeah.
But
like I've asked people, like, let's say you have an apple tree. Let's say it can produce apples for 15 years on average. Just making this up.
Yeah.
What are the apples like in year 3 versus year 15? What if you've been spraying that tree every year?
Yeah.
What's the pesticide content? What's the nutrient content? How are the apples different year to year and over the lifetime of fruit production? How does the tree know, okay, I've got to go through 3 seasons in order to start producing this fruit, and I'm only going to produce it for this long, and then I stop? Like, what are these signals? What's happening to the tree, maybe epigenetically, if it has such a thing, that's causing it to react differently over time,
Sure. Yeah, there are a couple of different things there. You mentioned epigenetics, but I'll talk about too. The tree does build up resource, it is creating kind of banks of carbohydrate resources. And so we see oftentimes a tree has to reach some level of threshold of kind of richness of those resources before it will really fruit. And, we see different tree species that fruit on different cycles, so some of them are annual, like a lot of our orchard plants. But even those, so like some peach trees, they're kind of actually every other year or something. And so they require some level of building up those resources before they can really produce all of that fruit. And some trees, wait many years between fruiting events. Like some of the rainforests in Southeast Asia that I've worked in, they'll go 5 years between fruiting events. And actually the whole forest, not a large proportion of the forest, will synchronize, and they all go off together. And there are layers to that, to why that might be happening. But it definitely takes a certain amount of time for them to build up enough resources and they want to produce a large crop as well. And so there are different strategies about, whether you produce a large crop or a small crop. But like you were talking about, you mentioned kind of epigenetics, that certainly has impact. Trees, we do have increasing amount of evidence that trees become kind of locally adapted. And so you can imagine a tree growing in a position for decades. It could begin to change its gene expression profiles and things, and potentially could become better adapted to a site. And that could be then inherited in the fruit. Because that's one thing about trees, that fruit is produced from the same tissue as the leaves. And so its somatic and its reproductive tissue come from the same original kind of stem cell or cambium, and they can inherit those things. And so that epigenetic change that we're beginning to see evidence of can be inherited through the seed and into the next generation. So there's certainly a lot of change that can happen in the lifespan of a tree, for sure.
Also, I know I'm jumping around. I was thinking now, all right, so the top side of a tree, above ground, takes in carbon dioxide, I guess, through the stomata. Where does the oxygen it produces, where does that come out of the tree?
Through the stomata as well, yeah.
Oh, it's the same in and out exchange there?
Yeah, That's right. And
So it doesn't come out anywhere else? Like what about the bark or the, other parts of the leaf or anything? Like the only place the tree breathes is through the same holes?
like you said, I mean, it's got a waxy cuticle on it. And so it doesn't
Yep.
exchange gases through other places. And so, yeah, it's exchanged through those pores. And, and the tree does use some of that oxygen as well to respire. It is burning sugars to make wood and new cells and things like that. So it burns some of the oxygen itself. But
Okay. What about the bark? There's probably people that I guess just study the bark. So what are some characteristics of it that are interesting, if you know?
Yeah, I mean, it's a protective outer layer. So there's actually a separate cambium that produces the bark. There's the cambium that makes the vascular tissue, but just outside of that, there's a bark cambium. And so it's generating a protective layer on the outside. And, every tree species kind of has its own characteristic bark, and that just depends on how the cells develop and how they're arranged. And so it's dead tissue as well. It functions as a dead tissue. And the oldest part of that tissue is on the outside. It's kind of turned over. It's kind of inverted. So the younger bark is against the bark cambium on the inside, and the older bark is on the outside. And so that comes off through time in many different shapes and forms on different kinds of trees. And yeah,
There's the bark, so it grows outwards. Does it get fatter and thicker over time? Like what happens?
sure, yeah, different species are different, but yeah, that it just gets pushed out. So there's another layer of bark put down on the inside, and so it pushes the other bark out, and so that's what creates the cracking and breaking off of the outer layers.
Okay.
Because the outermost part of the bark is actually the circumference of what the tree was several years ago, perhaps. So that's why it's all broken up and
Also, it dries out. I guess the exposed surface.
yeah.
Yeah, like if you looked at the bark, not longitudinally, I guess radially in and out, the moisture level would go down, and the outer bark is exposed to the air, so it'd be the most dry.
Yeah.
Interesting. What factors govern the thickness of the bark? The rate of growth. Like the role of the bark, I guess, is to keep water in,
Yeah.
but also to physically protect the tree. Like what are the roles of bark?
Right. There are many different kinds. I mean, so some trees are actually adapted to fire, and like, cork oak in Europe, for example. I mean, that's a fire adapted tree. And so that corky bark is actually adapted to prevent the fire. So they're not extremely hot fires. They're kind of frequent low grade fires that happen. And so once the tree is large enough and it's got a big corky layer of bark, that fire won't really do any damage to the tree. So some barks actually do perform very direct physical protection of the tree from environmental factors. But yeah, it's, also they keep out insects. So, that living tissue that I've talked about, that cambium that's producing the xylem and the phloem just inside the bark, there's a lot of sweet stuff in there. That's where the sap is, and that's where all the nutrients are. And so lots of insects and things want to get to it. And so you have a lot of boring beetles and things. And so the bark prevents those things from being able to easily access. So you have only a specially adapted boring beetle might be able to get into this tree. And oftentimes it's under only special circumstances when the tree might be stressed and can't actually kind of defend itself through other, producing phytochemicals and things, or alkaloids and things in its tissue, and prevent the insect from being able to eat it. But the bark definitely is like a front line of defense against many kind of environmental pressures and attacks and things.
Yeah. Interesting. What is if you look at it under a microscope, what would the cells of the bark look like? Like how does its composition differ?
Yeah, it differs from species to species, honestly. I mean, how they're kind of...
No, I mean, in a given tree, like a cedar, if I look at the composition of the bark and the cells, what would I see versus the cambium versus like the inner xylem layer?
They're just dead wood cells. I mean, they don't really have as much structure as like the xylem. Like the xylem are really like straws in a sense, and they're very orderly and stacked on top of one another. But the bark will be kind of interlocked and kind of connected to one another. So they're actually kind of trying to produce a shield against invasion. So there's a lot of kind of locking of the cells, and that then leads to the kind of the characteristic breaking apart and cracking that you see on different species.
But what's happened to cause bark to be what it is? Is it the cell wall is changing shape and morphology and stuff, and that's what makes the bark? Like, what makes the bark from the regular wood? What makes it different? Does anyone know?
Yeah, people do know. I have to say I'm getting kind of the limit of my knowledge about bark specifically. There are different kinds of wood cells. I mean, it's also some lignin, I think, but there's a lot of cellulose as well. So it's not as lignified as wood itself. And I think there are some compounds. You're kind of making me try to remember some of my basic tree physiology stuff. And I haven't really thought about this in such detail in a while, but
no problem. Yeah, I guess the more, at first it seems like, oh, what's to talk about with trees? But the more I'm sitting here looking at some outside, and the more I look at them, the more questions come to mind. And there's a lot of complication then. It's amazing. It's crazy,
They're very complicated and fascinating organisms. I mean, in some ways, that's what drew me to them. Is like I was talking about wanting to study primates compared to trees in the past. And I just found trees they're almost like an alien life form. I mean, they don't have a central nervous system. They don't have kind of a vital organ in a way, like animals have like vital organs, and we're very symmetrical, and we have, very pre-programmed set of organs and where they're positioned and things. But a tree is very adaptable to its circumstance and can be very plastic and responsive to the environment. And it's just a very different way of living and evolving. And I've found that very fascinating through my career, because it is a big challenge. I think it takes a lot of imagination to try to think like a tree, because they're more like a colony of growing points. You think about how a tree, in terms of its twig branches and the ends of its roots and things. So you've got these little growing points, and they're responding to the environment, and they're kind of competing with one another. So you look at the branch of a tree, there are all those little buds, right, where the leaves come from, and they're competing with one another. And so there is like a bad mutation or something. That branch, that little bud will die, and so that there's kind of a certain level of selection that is happening at the branch level all the time on a tree. And then part of the tree is in the sun, and part of the tree is not in the sun. And so you have a very different light and kind of humidity environment on those different branches. And so it's really this very large colony of growing points that are responding to the immediate environment. And so you can plant, you could take seeds from one tree and plant them in many different environments across the country, for example, and they would grow into very different trees, even though they're all very closely related to one another. So yeah, they're very complex, and even though it's kind of this deceptive simplicity, because they're just like a node with a bud and leaves, and so it's just this kind of modular growth form. But there's many different things you can do with this modular growth form.
Yeah, interesting. So what's the best way for people to find out more about your work? I guess there's many things to talk about still, but again, where could people go?
Yeah, they could go check out my website at the Morton Arboretum. You just search Chuck Cannon Morton Arboretum. I'm there on that website. I don't really have a great social media presence, and I've ResearchGate, if you're really interested in the science that we do and some of the more technical stuff, I'm on ResearchGate.
Okay.
But yeah, I'm actually moving to Singapore later this year, because I've botanic gardens for the last few decades of my career, and I'm getting back to the tropics. So I did a lot of my early work in Southeast Asia, and I'm going back to the Singapore Botanic Garden to lead a team in forest and tree research there. And so I'll be moving there. And so, I'll have a presence there and on their website as well. And I hope to kind of develop, I feel like I haven't done enough science communication. I feel like it's the one thing I have not done enough of. And so that I appreciate the opportunity to speak on your podcast about these things, because I think we do need to make people more aware of how fascinating trees are and how important forests are and things.
Okay, well, very good. Well, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. It's been a really good call. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks for having me on, and I appreciate talking to you too.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.